Hello, everyone. How are you doing? I know that you've been begging me. Actually, only one of you. I shouldn't say all of you. Some of you have been begging me to look into why you can't read the history of rhetoric that I promised you last week, because last week's lecture sort of followed along with it. And the answer is that I couldn't figure out what was going on. So, what I did was I actually went to Wikipedia, which you should never do, but unless you're going to use it the right way. I went to Wikipedia, I copied their timeline, I modified it just a little bit for us. But I do think it's helpful. It's a pretty detailed and yet clear um, timeline. It cuts the timeline into the periods that I cut them into. So I think it will help you follow along. Again, I don't recommend using Wikipedia for anything as a single source. But, in our case, what we're doing is just using it as sort of a formula or a piece of paper or whatever it is that you need to help you remember what we talk about during the course of this semester. So hopefully that'll be helpful to you. That is up and running right now. The second question of why it isn't in the content area, where it has week 1, week 2, week 3, is because literally I can't figure out how to put it there either. So here's what we're going to do. I will update the weekly sort of ideas of what we're working on, and I will put any attachments under the new tab of syllabus and information. So just where your syllabus is, you'll see now that it reads syllabus and information. Click on that, and I will try to put all the new stuff up towards the top for you. So hopefully this will solve all the problems. Again, that history is available to you right now. The second question I've gotten is about the papers, and I wanted to address that really quickly because I forget sometimes how short our timeline is. And you're right, we should probably get you some information about that as soon as possible. So what I'm going to do is I am going to tell you that your first and second paper may be turned in at any time during this semester. That is correct. You are hearing me correctly. You can turn it in any time prior to the end of the semester. I do not recommend that you wait to the end of the semester and write 2 papers. That would just be silly. However, they are both doing 2 different things. In the first paper, you're going to be demonstrating knowledge to me. That's it. Nothing more. In the second paper, you're going to actually be performing a rhetorical criticism. So they are 2 different papers. The first one is very short. I believe that it's like 3 pages to 5 pages, somewhere in there. And then the second one is longer. It is a 5 to 10 page paper. And when I put those minimums in there, that means that I don't know how you would possibly write enough for me to understand that you understand the concepts and ideas that you need in less or in fewer pages. So that's why those are the way that they are. So what I'm going to do is I am going to post the paper assignment in a written format for you. And I'm also going to post my rubric. And this rubric is for how I evaluate all papers. It doesn't change. It stays the same unless there's something drastic that happens to the world. Like when the internet first came out, I had to change the way that I evaluated evidence. Unless something drastic like that happens, it's been the same. So it will continue to stay the same. And if you have any questions on either of those, as always, just ask. I may not get back to you on the weekend very quickly, even on Friday, but I'll get back to you as soon as I can. The last thing that we are supposed to do is, I know that you probably looked at the syllabus and said, hey, we were supposed to be talking about Plato and Aristotle by now. And the answer to that is that not everybody has their book yet. So I've been kind of slowing down. And the other thing is that, hopefully those of you with the book have been reading. Hopefully those of you with the book have been, sort of keeping up with the schedule. As I told you, it would be, the schedule online is just for your help, for your information. As you could tell, I just changed the date for the first paper. Give it to me whenever, along with the second paper if you have to, I guess, but preferably sometime between now and then, preferably a couple weeks before then, because remember, I do have to grade them all. So you will see that your grades for your first assignment are up. Hopefully there were no glitches. I didn't see any glitches, and you'll be getting your second assignment soon. So let's talk a little bit about what we're supposed to be talking about. The first thing I'm going to tell you is that I have videos on my YouTube channel that are about Isocrates, but are not about Gorgias. And so I just wanted to quickly mention Gorgias in this video. So Gorgias or Gorgias, depending on how you want to pronounce it, they've been pronounced both ways, was both a writer, an author, a philosopher, I guess, sort of. He was a great speaker during the wars. And he is also utilized in some of Plato's works as a foil or as sort of like the opposite in his dialogues that he creates. If any of you have started reading Plato, you're probably like, oh, my head hurts. Why am I reading this? And I don't blame you. It's horrifying. The good news is Aristotle and the rest, none of them write in dialogue. Plato's the only one we have to get through. And I only give you a little bit of one of his works. So I think that's what I gave you. And I do that on purpose. I don't want you to be tortured with it. Although, as I've said several times, that book is a great solution to insomnia. So that's sort of, I know it's difficult to get through. We'll talk about what the important parts are in a second video that I'll be putting up today as well. So let's start off with Gorgias and quickly talk about why we put him first and why the Enconium on Helen is so important. The Enconium on Helen is literally a eulogy, but it's a eulogy designed to change or the immortality of, or the way that we talk about Helen of Troy. We all have heard some of the pithy comments about Helen of Troy. She had the lips that sunk a thousand ships. She was the most beautiful in the land. She was the cause of the Trojan War. Not all of these are in fact correct. The way that she was stolen by Paris in the movies, Orlando Bloom, I guess, I would go with him too. I don't know. But the point is that it's a little romanticized. How did that happen? How did it become so romanticized? Well, that's because of Gorgias's encomium to her. It's because Gorgias decided that it was important that people remember Helen in a way that did not blame her for the war so much. And in his oration, he says that Helen, okay, ladies and gentlemen who are offended by this, I apologize, but it is true. He says Helen was too dumb or too stupid or too weak to resist Paris. Probably true. That's one of his arguments, and whatever. I think we can ignore that one because the other ones make a heck of a lot more sense. In Greek times, of course, we didn't have a Christian God. We didn't have a Western civilization. We had paganism. We had Eastern religions, but none of them that we really affiliate ourselves with today. And so love was seen as an actual entity, capital L love. So it was seen as an entity. That means that it had control over people. So she was just overtaken by love. Love made her do this, made her go with Paris. And that's why the war started. Other things that started it were not because Helen was in love necessarily, or she was too weak. It's just that Paris practiced such incredible persuasion. He was so persuasive that he convinced her to do this, that she fell prey to his charms, if you will. So these are the kinds of things that Gorgias says, really are what caused the war. It's not Helen. It was the things that happened to Helen, and therefore we should remember her in a little better light than we did back then. Apparently, Helen had a bad rap. I don't know. I wasn't around. None of us were. I'm not really sure why he felt the need until I started doing eulogies myself, which I don't do them professionally. That sounded bad. But what I mean is, until I started having family members who were close enough to me that died that I had to do eulogies for, I didn't really understand it. And here's the responsibility of the eulogy. The responsibility of the eulogy of the Enconium is that whatever you say about that person is going to last forever. It is their story. It is their immortality. It is what people are going to remember. They're not going to remember a dead person in a casket. They're going to remember what somebody said about them, the stories that you have about them, and the memories that you have. And so you can literally change the way that we look at someone through the art of rhetoric. In this case, a certain type of rhetoric called epideictic rhetoric. We'll get more into that later, but epideictic rhetoric is basically ceremonial rhetoric. You hear it all the time, you just don't realize it. Ceremonial rhetoric at graduations, at birthday parties, at anniversaries, at weddings, and yes, at funerals. And those speeches may seem silly and stupid, and we make fun of them a lot of the times, but they are the immortality of the person who died. And so it's a heavy responsibility, but it can also change the way that we think about someone forever. So he really wanted to change how we thought about Helen. And if you get through it, which it's only 2 pages, so it's not too hard, you'll get to the bottom two paragraphs or one paragraph. I don't remember exactly with the Enconium, but with your edit of the Enconium, I should say. But the last paragraph or so, he starts talking about how he just really enjoyed writing this piece. It was just an exercise in feeling good. He enjoyed it. And he says in there that rhetoric should be enjoyable, that what we should do is enjoy the practice of rhetoric, of telling these stories, of sort of retelling or reconstructing the history of someone. If you don't believe me, you need not turn much further. I know that this is before your time too, but Bill Clinton's presidency, while he was president, Richard Nixon died. And the one thing that the president does is he does a eulogy for the for former presidents that died. Usually that's just tradition. And so um, when he had to do this eulogy, we all just thought, what's he going to say? I mean, Nixon was seen as a traitor. He was the second Benedict Arnold, who, by the way, wasn't really a traitor either. He was a curse on the country. He was a horrible president. He spied on us. He spied on other people. He spied on other politicians. What are we going to say here? Is you can't go up there and say he was a great patriot. So what do we do? Well, of course, Clinton did the only thing he could do, and it was brilliant, by the way, which was to take the things that are good about Nixon and talk about those and focus on those. In other words, that we make the dearly departed less departed and a little more dear, that we like them a little bit more than when we went into it. And so what we end up with is a speech about Nixon and his incredible abilities in foreign policy. He could read global economics and global politics better than almost any other president that we've had, at least in the modern era. He was very good with that. He made a lot of strides. Most people forget that because they're too busy thinking about what happened in Washington, D.C. I don't blame them, but Bill Clinton was able to really get into the good things that we needed to remember about Richard Nixon and the way he handles that contrast of the Nixon that we are told about and we remember in the immediate and the Nixon that we should remember. So again, the Enconium is there for you and to tell you not only that you can reconstruct somebody's history and change the way that someone is in your eyes, just basically by reconstructing them, but also in that last paragraph or two where he says that rhetoric should be enjoyable, you're probably A, laughing right now, or B, horrified. Either way, that little section there is what's known as an epilogue. Now, some of you might be like, well, I know what an epilogue is. And an epilogue is, of course, that thing which occurs at the end of a speech or a book or in this case, a narration or at the end of a written piece. And the question is, what are you supposed to do with an epilogue? Well, the epilogue doesn't just underscore what's important. In fact, most of the time it doesn't deal with the subject matter at all. Instead, it talks about how you should read the work, how you should really look at it. What was the point of it? Why? What was the motivation? Why did somebody do this? And in the end, Gogias says this was enjoyable. You should sit down and write somebody else's eulogy sometime. It'll be a good time for you. And you know what? In part, he's right. Not the writing a eulogy, imagining someone's dead part, but the practice of being able to understand that you can change a memory or the memory of a person or an action simply by the way that you talk about it. And I'll give you one last example. This is a personal example, and I apologize because, as we all know, rhetoric is actually about mass communication, not really about interpersonal. But my husband and I dated in college. And then I went off and got my PhD. He went off and married a couple different women and had some kids. And now we're back and we're married now, obviously, since I refer to him as my husband. It took us about 15 years to go through that whole process, but I'm sure we both learned a lot and everything's good now. But when we got back together this time, which was in 2012, he said to me, he said, "Well, aren't you mad at me for leaving like I did?" And I said, "No. If you hadn't left, I never would have gone on to get my PhD. I would have been working in some Motel 6 in Springdale, Arkansas with you. I didn't really, think too much about it. You had something else you wanted to do, and I told you to go do it because I wanted you to do that. When you love somebody, you want them." He goes, "You have a ridiculously clean and good memory of me that's not true." And I really thought about that, and he may be right. I don't know. I mean, I was very hurt when he left. I do remember that. My mother was devastated, and then when she found out I was marrying the guy, she really lost it. But I don't remember being that mad or that upset at him. And so that sort of gives us freedom to move on to the next thing. So if you were one of those people that had a horrible high school experience, like me, you could say, "I never want to go back there again." But if you go back to your reunions, you find out that nothing that happened there was really all that bad. We can recreate it. In fact, that's why we have anniversaries, to remind ourselves of how happy we were when we got married or when something important happened in our life. We have birthdays to celebrate the happiness of being around for another year and that experience. So it's important for us to understand that one of the first jobs of rhetoric was to celebrate epideictic, or what we call ceremonial address, to celebrate. So you should have a good time with that type of rhetoric. All right, that's all I'm going to say about the Enconium. This is also a lot longer than I intended it to be. So I'm going to move on. Again, the things that I'm putting up on the website or on Blackboard right now already have the timeline up. I'm going to put the first paper up, the assignment, and I'm going to put up my paper rubric that will be for both papers. And then I'll get the second paper assignment up shortly as well. I know some of you are overachievers. However, I know none of you read that whole book yet. So stick with me. That's probably not the smartest thing to do anyway. Read ahead, but don't go crazy. And hopefully we're all going to catch up and be where we need to be as of this week. All right, I'll see you in a few.